Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at the Fouga CM.170 Magister, recently released by Azur-Poly. The aircraft is now available from the in-sim marketplace, so I thought we'd take a look. We'll be carrying out a full review. I'm sure that many of you are already aware, but for those who aren't, that means we're going to be first taking a look at the external modelling and texturing of the aircraft. We'll then do the same with the internal modelling and texturing. After that we'll be carrying out a full startup, we'll be carrying out a full flight in the aircraft. We'll put the aircraft through some manoeuvres as well, obviously with it being a jet trainer and having some reasonable aerobatic capabilities. We'll come back for a landing, we'll carry out a shutdown, and then we'll finish up the review. I'll give you my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. The CM.170, as you can see for yourselves, quite a quirky little aircraft. I'm quite interested to see how it flies. I think it should be good fun. We're currently on the ground at La Mole Airport in France, just on the southern coast. If you do enjoy the video and find it to be of use, then please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. So let's get the review underway. We'll continue on with our external tour of the Magister. So Azur-Poly, at least to me, a little bit of an unknown quantity in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I believe they also created the BD5 jet for the sim, but I've yet to try that myself. So far though, of what I've seen of their work, I have to say I'm very impressed. I think the CM.170 looks like a very nice aircraft. The Magister is not really an aircraft that I'm all that familiar with at all. I think I've probably only seen it once or twice in pictures. I know it is a fairly famous aircraft though, with various air forces around the world, and also used quite extensively for military aerobatic displays. The aircraft was primarily used by the French Air Force as a jet trainer, and also used quite famously by the Patrouille de France for their aerobatic display team. Anyway, that's the livery we're sporting today, and again I think overall Azur-Poly have done a nice job with it. All up, if memory serves me correctly, the aircraft comes with 8 liveries based on various different air forces. I will say that some of the liveries I'm led to believe are not entirely accurate, they do need a little bit of work. But certainly if you're a little bit of a layman like me, they're more than good enough. The detailing itself is quite nice. The same is true of the aircraft's modelling, I would say. Unless you're particularly familiar with the Magister, it's pretty hard to spot any major omissions. As far as I can tell, the contouring of the aircraft and indeed the general proportions seem to be pretty accurate. And for sure, the general quality of the model is very good. It was pretty hard to find any rough edges, any panels that didn't line up, or any areas lacking in poly count. The Magister does apparently have gliding heritage in the airframe. I think that's pretty clear to see. Certainly the jet reminds me quite a bit of the C-22J. Another quirky little feature, the aircraft actually has a wheel at the rear of the airframe. Essentially, as I understand it, when we land the aircraft we can pitch back onto our tail, induce a little bit of aero braking to help slow the aircraft down. I think that'd be quite fun. We'll try and remember to do that on landing. Again, the modelling detail is very nice. All of the panelling seems to line up correctly. We've got the various aerials modelled there as well, various inlets. All of the riveting looks pretty good as well, and you can see that the textures are pretty high definition. The same is true in the more hidden away areas of the aircraft. You can see in the wheel well bay, for example, very nice dirt and texturing. We've got the hydraulic lines there as well running up from the landing gear. The texturing there in the landing light, I'm not sure whether that's intentional or a missing texture. It does look a little bit similar to the missing texture, if that makes sense, that we get in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It doesn't look awful, and it may well be that that is the texture that the designer chose. I just thought it was an interesting point to note. And the only other area of the aircraft really that I found the modelling to be slightly lower in standard was the pilots. Again, they're not bad, they're nice custom models, but they are certainly a little bit more clunky in terms of modelling, a little bit lower resolution in terms of texturing. And on a final note, as you'll have seen during our walk around, we do have a couple of external fixtures and fittings, namely we have the chocks, the engine intake covers and the pitot covers. All of those can be selected on or off via an onboard EFB. We'll take a look at that in just a moment's time. So coming down now into the front seat of the aircraft's cockpit. Overall the cockpit of the CM.170 is done to a very nice standard. The modelling is very decent. I think the colorisation is excellent. It really has that period feel to it. Texturing is very crisp and very sharp. We'll take a closer look at some of the textures in just a moment. And again you can see we have the onboard tablet. Again we'll take a look at that in just a moment's time. Coming in closer to the instruments, again everything modelled very nicely, the texturing very reasonable. The instruments are easy to read, although perhaps just a little bit too much reflection there off the glass. The angle here does slightly exacerbate the situation. Detailing throughout the cockpit is really good. It was actually a very pleasant surprise. I wasn't really sure what to expect from Azur-Poly. And I would say that the aircraft systems as well, equally done very nicely. There does seem to be a pretty decent amount of depth to them. Of course, as usual, we'll take more of a look at that during the flight itself. It doesn't really matter where you look throughout the cockpit, the texturing and the modelling done very well. You can see all of the cabling and the wiring there behind the rudder pedals, and even down in the footwell, the really nice texturing there on the floor, where the pilot's feet have obviously worn away at the paint. And lastly, as far as the front cockpit goes, just to take a quick look at the tablet. Overall, the options there are fairly limited, but also very nice. In terms of aircraft state, we can opt to fit the external ground equipment that we've already seen. That will also set the aircraft into a cold and dark state. We can choose to open up or close the canopies via the tablet. We can also do that manually via the canopy controls themselves. We have a smoke option. We can turn the smoke on or off, again via the tablet or via a cockpit control. And as you can see, we can also choose from various smoke colours. We have an oxygen valve control, which again we can use a cockpit click spot to turn on or off, but we can also use the tablet. We can also fill up the aircraft's oxygen supply from here, and depletion is modelled. Lastly, a nice little touch, we can actually choose to induce a hydraulic failure into the aircraft, so again there is a little bit of systems depth and modelling going on there. And I believe if you do induce said failure, then you will actually have to manually pump the landing gear down. Anyway, that's a brief overview of the front cockpit of the aircraft. Again, we'll take more of a look at that throughout the flight. Obviously the CM170 is a tandem-seated jet trainer though, so we do also have a rear cockpit. The rear cockpit of the aircraft has been modelled to the exact same level of detail as the front cockpit by Azur-Poly. That's really great to see. The aircraft can be flown from the rear seat, although unfortunately there doesn't seem to be any 3D pilot models, so that does reduce the immersion I find a little bit. And yet another quirky feature of the aircraft, with the seats in the tandem layout being level with one another, the view out the front of the cockpit for the instructor is actually pretty limited by the student pilot. So as you can see, the designers actually fitted the aircraft with a periscope to help aid the instructor's forward vision. That's been nicely modelled in a visual sense, although there's no functionality there, you can't actually use it to see over the top of the airframe. So again, overall a really nice effort from Azur-Poly. This is my first aircraft in the sim from them. And so far so good, I'm really enjoying what we've seen so far. I think the aircraft is completed to a very high standard for the price point. All that being said, the thing that most intrigues me about this little jet is how it's going to fly. I think it should be quite good fun. So let's get ourselves sat down and comfortable in the front seat. We'll get the aircraft started up and up in the air. So we are now in the cockpit of the CM170 and we're going to get the aircraft started up. The process does take a little bit of time, but it's pretty straightforward overall. For the start checklist, the master battery can come on. Left throttle is closed. Left fuel valve is closed. The starter will select to the left engine. I'll keep fairly quiet during the startup sounds, they're really excellent. We just want to wait until we come up through 1000 RPM and then we'll introduce the fuel into the engine. You can see the spool up time on the engine there, nice and slow, very realistic. And we're just coming up on our 1000 RPM, so the ignition and fuel injection can go on. I'll just give that a couple of seconds, and then the fuel valve itself can go on. So the engine will continue to spool up, we'll just wait until we're through 4000 RPM. And there's 4000. So the injection and ignition can come off. And we'll just wait for the engine to stabilise. So the engine is stable around 7000 RPM. Again, you can hear really excellent engine startup sounds. Quite noisy, but I'll definitely forgive it that, as it's a really nice sound set. Anyway, we're going to head outside the aircraft. We'll listen to those startup sounds again externally, just to give you a feel of that. And I'll come back to you again once we have 2 good starts, and we'll run through our after start checks. Okay, so we do have two good engine starts. The jet pipe temperature is checked. Oil temperature looks good. The oil pressure there showing above 1 bar as per the checklist. The generator master switch can come on, and we'll cage that up. Running through the after start checks, we'll close up the canopy. The canopy's already closed, so we'll close ours up. And just making sure that's locked. You can hear there is an associated change in sound there, which is great. The gyro compass and the attitude indicator power supplies can come on. Hydraulic pressure is checked. Aileron servo is on, the warning light is out. Spoilers are retracted. We'll test the brakes on the taxi out. We'll set our altimeter. I believe the QNH is around 1030, the aerodrome elevation about 80 feet. So the altimeter is set, and we'll just do a quick flight control check before we make our way out towards the runway. So flight controls are full free and in the correct sense. We are now ready for the taxi, and we'll make our way out towards the holding point. Okay, so we're now down at the holding point for runway 06. As I said, this is the part I'm looking forward to. I think the Magister is going to be a fun little aircraft to fly. Anyway, we'll put that to the test. We'll just run through our before takeoff checks. So the flaps we can set for takeoff. And we do have 15 degrees set on the flaps. Canopy is closed and locked. Oxygen can come on. To do that, we just click on the hidden away click spot down the back. And you can see we do have oxygen flow. We have pretty much 100% of our oxygen capacity on board. And lastly, just checking that we have neutral on the trim. Park brake can come off. A little bit tricky to see final approach there with the tree line. We'll assume we're clear of traffic. It's clear upwind. Just coming up on the throttles to get the aircraft onto the roll. Overall, the Magister taxis fairly nicely. Doesn't need too much rudder input to get it to turn. And it does feel a little bit strange being quite so low to the ground. So we'll be departing off runway 06. We'll be tracking straight out to the east. We're going to head over towards Saint Tropez. We'll take in the scenery. We'll obviously throw the aircraft around a little bit as we do so. So back onto the brakes. The runway heading checks will come up on the power. Again, overall the engine sounds are really nice. I gather from what I've heard from others, they're pretty accurate to the aircraft as well. We'll come all the way up to full power. And off the brakes. And away we go. The rudder response feels okay. It's definitely a little bit sensitive, but it's easy enough to control the aircraft. Just coming up on 100 knots, so back on the stick. We'll try not to over-rotate. Obviously we're pretty close to the ground. And we're up. Tap the brakes, the gear can come up. According to the manual, we're supposed to climb at 120 knots, but that seems like it's going to give us an incredibly steep rate of climb. We'll go for around 200. We'll come back on the power as well now. We've got decent speed there, the flaps can come up. And the after takeoff checks, the gear is up, the flaps are retracted, oxygen is on, that's the after takeoff checklist complete. So we should have Saint Tropez more or less right off the nose. We'll just hang a left to put the scenery out the right side of the cockpit. And Saint Tropez you can see there, just off tar 1 o'clock. We'll head out over the bay, we'll check out the scenery first, and then, as I say, we'll throw the aircraft around. So far so good though, I like how the aircraft felt on the takeoff overall. Once again, a little bit twitchy on the rudder, but rotation actually felt very nice. The aircraft did feel a little bit reticent there to get airborne, but in a fairly realistic way. Rotate speed according to the manual is 90 knots, I think we rotated around 100, so we actually had a little bit of airspeed in hand. We'll see how the aircraft performs again low speed when we come back for the landing. In bank though it feels very nice, it's very stable. The aircraft does have a reasonable feeling of weight to it. You need a significant input on the controls to actually get the aircraft into a bank. If I just put in a very light input on the controls there, you can see the aircraft taking quite a bit of time there to respond. In terms of the rudder, that feels pretty Microsoft Flight Simulator-esque. Pretty short and sharp on the rudder there, and not much in terms of any oscillation. The aircraft correcting back to centre fairly quickly. So there's Saint Tropez just passing down below us. Overall the visibility out of the cockpit pretty nice. Not the best of any of the jets in the sim, but certainly adequate. So we'll make a low pass over Saint Tropez itself and we'll come back in, build up some speed around for the loop. We need to be 280 knots for the loop. We'll come back up to full power. That wind noise will be FS realistic once again. Fortunately, I'm forever forgetting to turn that off during reviews. Decent amount of speed now, so coming back on the stick. As we're pretty fast and low level here, we'll turn the first loop into an Immelman. The aircraft definitely feels good on the controls, having to use quite a lot of pressure on the stick here to get us through the top of the loop, but we're pretty high speed, so that makes sense. And coming over the top, we'll roll out onto our current heading. Again, the aircraft does feel pretty nice in terms of flight modelling. I would say it feels very representative of what I would expect the CM.170 to handle like. The only thing is, not a whole lot of feedback in terms of, I would say the flight model, but generally it tends to be the case it's actually the sounds that give you the feedback in the sim, but yeah, not a ton of feedback in terms of the sounds. Most of the sounds that you can hear there are actually FS realistic sounds. But a very enjoyable aircraft to fly nonetheless. Quite interesting coastal features down there on the left. You can see a little bit of longshore drift, I think, moving the sand along the beaches. And again, Saint Tropez just off the left wing. So we've got a little bit of altitude, a little bit of speed in hand now. We'll go for the full loop. So back up on the power. Just pitch for, again, we need at least 280 knots in the loop. We'll go for 300. Says 300, back on the stick. The jet quite slow to respond with smaller control inputs. But I think that's to its credit. It's really only the rudder that so far feels a bit Microsoft Flight Simulator-esque. A little bit of a strange simmy there, I'm not sure whether or not that was track IR. It looked like it was the jet. We'll go straight into another loop there, see what happens. That seemed a little bit strange to me. So almost fully back on the stick now. You can see we did lose quite a bit of speed there in the first loop. There's the stall warning as well. No buffeting or any stall behaviour though, we'll try the stall out in just a moment. We'll pull through the bottom of the loop slowly here again just to build up a little bit of speed. And we'll try one last slightly more aggressive loop now, again just to see if we can induce that slightly strange twitch from the flight model there. It seems that was a one-off, so I'm not entirely sure what caused that. We'll come back off the power, we'll pitch the nose up once again, we'll go into a power off stall. All of the flight instruments as well, very nice and smooth. Pretty easy to read. They do take a little bit of getting used to, particularly that RPM gauge. So just going back through 100 knots, 6,500 feet. There's a stall warning. And not too much there in terms of stall behaviour, the nose just coming straight down. The aircraft not wanting to go into a spin. That may or may not be accurate to the real world aircraft, obviously with it being a jet trainer, you probably don't want to have aggressive stall behaviour. We'll try one more. But overall, again, not too much feedback really in terms of that stall. We had the stall warning and then the nose just dropped pretty much straight away. And fairly suddenly as well. So it's coming up through 5,500. There's 100 knots. You can see our vertical speed reducing all the way back on the stick now. There's the stall warning. And again, the nose just dropping. Nothing too much going on there. If we let the nose drop, speed recovers. And eventually we regain elevator authority once again. So I'm not sure how accurate that is to the real world jet. Doesn't seem like the best flight modelling I've seen in the sim, but it's reasonable overall. Be nice to have some buffeting sounds. Maybe a little bit of visual buffeting as well. We'll try a roll, max deflection out to the left. We're doing 200 knots here at the moment, so we'll go full left on the stick. Roll rate seems very reasonable. Obviously with those big wings, not expecting the aircraft to be particularly high in terms of roll rate. We'll just try another one. Yeah, I think that seems pretty good. And lastly, we'll just come fully back on the stick, pull a load of G, up to around 4G there, just trying to induce a spin now. Speed bleeding off. As the speed comes back though, we're really losing a lot of elevator authority there. And now the most we can really sustain is about 2G. And that's it, we're not seemingly going to be able to put the aircraft into a spin. We'll try one more really aggressive manoeuvre just to see if we can induce one. So building up a little bit of speed once again. There's 300. We'll come back on the stick, we'll basically get the aircraft into a stall, then we'll put in a boot full of rudder and aileron. Just see if we can't upset the aircraft a little bit more. There's that strange twitch again. It could be FS realistic, but I haven't seen that on any other aircraft so far. Okay, so we're right back around 90 knots now. There's the stall warning, I've got full right rudder. Cut the power. Really try my best to induce a spin. Even with the full right rudder there, the aircraft very placid. Don't think we're going to be able to get the aircraft to spin. And lastly, we'll just come back up to full power once again. We'll get ourselves pointed back towards La Mole. And we'll see what sort of top speed we can achieve. So there's full power, more or less straight and level. We'll just keep trimming out the aircraft. Speed's still building fairly slowly here. We're up through about 340 knots. The field should be just off at our 10 o'clock. You can just see the runway lights there. We'll come back in onto runway 06. Speed's still building there at the moment. Up through about 380 knots now. Looks like we've probably burned through our wing tanks there. We're slowly reducing there on the centre tank. Looks like we're topping out about 390 in terms of speed, which, if memory serves me correctly, is broadly correct for the Magister. So I'll come off the power once again. We'll try the speed brakes. They seem to slow the aircraft down pretty quickly, but you can see we do have 3 on each wing, so again, probably to be expected. And we're looking for an approach speed of about 110 knots. We'll join back in for a left-hand base. Just let that speed bleed off a little bit more and then we'll start configuring the aircraft. So flight model overall, not bad by any means. I quite like how the aircraft flies, it's good fun, but I would say it broadly behaves by the numbers. It just doesn't have quite as much feedback as some other flight models that we tried in the sim. Anyway, we'll take the gear down. And we'll start configuring. We'll take a stage of flap. We have 3 greens there on the gear. The aircraft feels a little bit nose high here at approach speed. It actually feels quite close to the stall. One of the issues I did notice with the jet is the C of G seems to be pretty out according to the load manager in the sim. We'll talk more about that at the end. We'll take full flaps and we want to approach around 110 knots. So landing checks, we have gear down, 3 greens, hydraulic pressure is checked, landing light not required, the flaps are set. Okay, so we're going to have to fly a little bit of a curved approach here onto runway 06. Just going to take a few extra knots here on the approach speed, as I find the aircraft's a little bit of a handful at low speed. We're going to have to stay a little bit high as well here just to clear the tree line. We'll try and get the aircraft down onto its tail for a bit of aero braking, but it's not the longest runway here at Le Mans, so we'll probably have to come onto the brakes fairly sharpish. Quite heavy now in pitch. Cutting the power. Probably flared a little bit high there given that we're so low to the ground. Even with full backstick there, the tail not wanting to come up. So pretty hard to get that aero braking in. Overall the aircraft felt reasonable, but it feels pretty nose heavy at low speed. The manual says the approach speed is 110 knots. It feels a little bit skitterish at 110 knots. I'd want to take a little bit more speed there. And you lose most elevator authority in the flare actually, so it's quite hard to get a smooth landing out of the jet. So overall, as far as the flight model goes, I would say the aircraft is good fun to fly. It's not quite where I was hoping it would be, in as much as it does have some deficiencies. It does feel slightly Microsoft Flight Simulator overall, but it's not bad, it's good fun to fly. So we'll just park up to the left here of the refueling station. So again, the jet slowed down, we'll swing out, face back towards the south. And onto the brakes, park brake can come on. Shutdown checklist, the oxygen can come off. And you can see no longer any oxygen flow there. pitot heat is off. Heading and attitude indicator power supplies can come off. Aileron servo is off. We'll close up the left fuel valve. And we do have a good shutdown there on the left. Do the same on the right. And a good shutdown there on the right. We'll open up the canopy. Generator can come off. And lastly, the battery master can come off. So just one last little demo for you before we finish up. We're going to try activating the hydraulics failure on the EFB. So we'll hit trigger failure. You can see we are losing main circuit pressure there. That's confirmed on the hydraulics gauge. On the Magister, both the gear, the spoilers and the brakes are all operated hydraulically. So if you lose hydraulics, you will lose all 3 systems on the main system at least. In the sim, only the spoiler failure and the gear failure are modelled. The brakes work regardless of the hydraulic system pressure. Anyway, we'll try extending the gear. So the gear switch down. You can see currently we don't have 3 greens there on the gear indication. To lower the gear we have to activate the emergency secondary hydraulic circuits. And again, still no green lights there on the gear at the moment. So we have to pump the emergency hydraulic pump manually. And you can see in doing so the gear is extended and we now have our 3 lights, we're ready for landing. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our outing in the Fouga CM.170. The Magister certainly seems to offer another fun little option within Microsoft Flight Simulator. It certainly has a lot of good points about it, it does have some negatives as well, we'll run through those briefly now. As usual, we'll start out with the negatives, work our way through to the positives. Overall I think the aircraft is a really nice effort from Azur-Poly. And again, it's my first aircraft of theirs in the sim. For me, there are 3 negatives really with the product, one of them being fairly major, the other 2 being somewhat more minor. The major negative for me is the flight model, and that's not to say that all aspects of the flight model are bad, but I think there are a couple of areas that could use some work. As always, a large amount of that is conjecture on my part, never having flown the aircraft. But certainly at the extremes of the flight envelope, the flight model seemed somewhat basic, it did have that Microsoft Flight Simulator feel to it. We saw that the stall characteristics were very sedate, we couldn't get the aircraft into a spin, that may or may not be accurate. Again, as we saw during the flight, I actually thought the jet handled quite nicely under normal flight conditions. Flight control inputs felt good, the aircraft had a reasonable feeling of weight to it, and broadly speaking it seemed to fly and feel as you might expect a light jet trainer to feel. Rudder input felt much the same as most aircraft in the sim, roll actually felt really nice on the aircraft, pitch felt good except at low speed where, as I mentioned a couple of times, we tended to lose elevator authority there. Now of course you would expect that to some degree, but at approach speeds the aircraft didn't feel particularly easy to handle. We somewhat fell out of the sky onto the runway as opposed to being able to gently let the aircraft down. And again that was with a few extra knots over the 110 that the manual gives for approach speed. I think at 110 knots the aircraft would be a real handful in the flare. Another reason that I think the aircraft is slightly off in pitch in terms of elevator authority, or maybe CFG, again we'll talk about that in just a moment's time. We looked at that rear wheel on the Magister and I've watched a couple of real world videos, the aircraft do sit back on the rear wheel and use some aero braking to slow down. During that landing I used full back pressure on the stick and we couldn't even get the nose to come up slightly, so I suspect there is an issue there in terms of how the aircraft's modelled. I suspect a lot of those issues might have something to do with the CFG. Looking at the CFG in the Sim's Fuel and Load Manager, it's pretty far off. It's certainly well outside of the indicated limits on the aircraft's weight and balance page. Of course I did try adjusting the aircraft's weight and balance to bring it within limits, but having done that the aircraft just went and sat on its tail. So there definitely appears to be an issue there, and I suspect that's what's contributing to the strange handling characteristics. Again, the aircraft also felt pretty close to the stall at 110 knots. So I do think that the flight model could use some improvement, particularly at the extremes of the envelope, and I do think there are currently some issues with the aircraft's CFG. We also noticed during the climb, again the manual calls for 120 knots initially in the climb, but that would have given a very high nose-up attitude. Again, that could be accurate to the real-world aircraft, I'm not entirely sure. I would have said that perhaps the aircraft seemed a little bit overpowered, but overall the top speed actually seemed pretty reasonable. Just to reiterate though, under normal conditions the aircraft actually flew quite nicely and it's certainly good fun to cruise around in. My other negatives with the product are much more minor in nature. Firstly, it would have been nice to have the option to remove the pilot models, at least while the jet sat on the ground. Some add-ons do have that option, others don't. I'm not really going to hold Azur-Poly to that one, but it's always nice as an option to have, just to see the aircraft in a more realistic cold and dark state. And my last negative for the product would be the aircraft's manual. Overall it's done very nicely, it's certainly very slick in presentation. It does have a lot of nice detail in there, for example it thoroughly explains the systems, it gives you some pretty decent performance data. However, it's pretty much entirely lacking in actually teaching you how to fly the aircraft. It doesn't run through takeoff technique, landing technique, things of that nature. So if you are unfamiliar with the Magister, and I suspect most of us will be, I found I had to use quite a lot of guesswork in flying the aircraft. That's about it as far as my negatives go. In terms of positives, I've got plenty of good things to say about the aircraft as well. Firstly, touching on the FPS, the aircraft is very FPS friendly. It was broadly on a par with the default Cessna 152 in terms of frame rate within my sim. Once again, I think the aircraft is modelled and textured very nicely. It was very hard to find too much to fault there. There's lots of little attentions to detail. There's actually a couple of touches where initially I questioned those as being inaccurate, but having gone away and looked at some pictures of the real-world aircraft, it seems that Azur-Poly have got the modelling spot on. Obviously we only looked at one livery today. The aircraft again does come with a nice selection of liveries, which seem to be pretty accurate, but I gather there are one or two that do have some inaccuracies. So externally, I really like the aircraft. I think internally it looks even better. We obviously got a good look at the aircraft throughout the flight, and again, overall I think it's coloured very well. It looks very authentic for the period. The systems depth of the aircraft was also surprisingly good. Again, I'm not all that familiar with Azur-Poly's previous work, but I was pleasantly surprised to see a pretty detailed aircraft in terms of systems from a smaller developer. For example, having that hydraulics failure implementation with the EFB, that's a really nice touch. Obviously, Azur-Poly certainly didn't have to go to such lengths, and nobody would have been any the wiser. So overall, I think it shows a great deal of care and attention. It shows that a lot of love has gone into the product, and that's quite clear to see. The same goes for the sounds. Again, I'm not familiar with the CM170 myself, but from what I've read elsewhere, it seems that the sounds are very accurate to the real-world aircraft. The engine sounds are really good, particularly during the startup, and the cockpit sounds very nice as well. There are one or two switches in the cockpit missing sounds, and again, it would be nice to have a little bit more auditory feedback in terms of manoeuvring the aircraft. I think the lack of sounds whilst manoeuvring the Magister is one of the reasons that the flight model felt a little bit more sterile than some of the other aircraft that I've tried in the sim. But again, a big thumbs up on the sounds as far as I'm concerned, and it's really nice to see a smaller developer really nailing the sounds. Anyway, in summary, the Fouga CM.170 Magister, a really nice little aircraft from Azur-Poly. As I mentioned just a moment ago, you can tell that a lot of love, care and attention's gone into the aircraft. And really, in most respects, it's quite an exemplary effort from a small developer. I think it's a nice offering for the price, again though I would just like to see a little bit more work on the flight model. Anyway guys, once again I do hope you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. As ever, a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support, very much appreciated. Hope all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.